The polite laughter surrounding Ethan Caldwell slowly faded, but Maya Johnson's concern did not. She picked up the silver serving tray she had set aside only moments earlier and continued weaving gracefully between tables, offering sparkling water and freshly poured iced tea to guests who barely noticed her passing. Outwardly, everything appeared exactly as it should. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the elegant chandelier. Investors discussed multimillion-dollar partnerships with confident smiles. Waiters moved with practiced precision across the polished marble floor. Yet Maya's attention kept drifting upward. Every few moments she caught another faint metallic click. Tiny. Irregular. Easy to dismiss unless someone was intentionally listening for it. She quietly glanced toward one of the banquet supervisors, Carlos Ramirez, who was arranging dessert plates near the ballroom entrance. As she approached, she lowered her voice. "Carlos." He looked up. "Everything all right?" Maya nodded slightly before looking toward the chandelier. "Have maintenance finished inspecting the main fixture?" Carlos frowned. "I thought they did this morning. I overheard them saying they needed to come back." Carlos looked up at the chandelier, then back at Maya. "You think something is wrong?" Maya chose her words carefully. "I do not know for certain. I only know I have heard unusual movements several times." Carlos hesitated. "I can call engineering." Maya smiled gratefully. "Thank you." Without creating alarm, Carlos quietly stepped into the hallway and reached for his radio. Meanwhile, Ethan had already moved onto the ballroom stage where enormous digital screens displayed architectural renderings of his newest development project. Camera crews adjusted their equipment while photographers gathered near the front. The audience applauded as Ethan stepped behind the podium. His confident smile returned immediately. "Good afternoon, everyone." More applause followed. Maya continued serving drinks while listening with only half her attention. Her eyes never stayed away from the chandelier for very long. Another metallic sound echoed above. This time it lasted slightly longer. She noticed something else. One row of crystal strands beneath the fixture swayed almost imperceptibly despite the ballroom doors remaining closed and the air conditioning barely running. A quiet feeling settled inside her. Not panic. Instinct. Years earlier, before financial hardship forced her to leave community college, Maya had completed several city-sponsored workplace safety courses while working temporary jobs at convention centers. One instructor had repeated a sentence she never forgot. "Structures usually whisper before they fail." Most people ignored the whispers. Maya never had. Carlos returned several minutes later, his expression apologetic. "Engineering is on the other side of the hotel, responding to a kitchen equipment issue." Maya remained calm. "Did they say when they could come?" 10. Maybe 15 minutes. Maya looked toward the crowded tables positioned directly beneath the chandelier. Hundreds of guests continued eating, laughing, and discussing contracts worth more money than she could imagine. She quietly counted the people seated underneath the enormous fixture. Nearly 40. Her concern deepened. Across the ballroom, Ethan continued speaking confidently about innovation, growth, and vision. Every sentence drew another round of applause. Several investors nodded enthusiastically, while reporters scribbled notes. To everyone watching, the afternoon represented another remarkable success story. Maya wished she could believe the same. She approached Carlos once more. "Could we at least close those center tables until engineering arrives?" Carlos looked uncertain. "Only Mr. Caldwell can approve moving the VIP section." Maya followed his eyes toward the stage. Ethan was shaking hands with one of the keynote investors while cameras flashed continuously. Interrupting him again would almost certainly make the situation worse. She understood that. Even so, she looked once more toward the chandelier. Click. This time she heard it clearly. Then another sound followed. A faint creak that seemed to travel through the decorative support above the ballroom ceiling. Maya quietly set down another tray, took a slow breath, and made a decision. If authority refused to listen, she would find another way to protect people without creating unnecessary panic. She calmly walked toward several elderly guests seated beneath the chandelier and smiled warmly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said gently, "would you mind joining me for a complimentary dessert presentation near the garden windows? Our pastry chef has prepared something very special, and I would love for you to be the first to see it." The elderly couple exchanged curious glances before smiling politely. "A special dessert?" the gentleman asked. Maya nodded warmly. "Our pastry chef has prepared a small tasting for a few guests before it is added to the menu. We would be honored if you joined us." The woman laughed softly. "Well, that sounds delightful." They slowly stood and followed Maya toward the garden windows on the opposite side of the ballroom. She thanked them sincerely before quietly approaching another nearby table. This one was occupied by a young family with 2 children. "Excuse me," Maya said with the same gentle smile. "We have opened a beautiful photo area overlooking the skyline for families. The afternoon light is perfect right now if you would like a complimentary family photograph." The parents immediately looked interested. "Really?" Maya nodded. "Only for a few minutes before the presentation continues." The little girl clapped excitedly while her younger brother eagerly climbed down from his chair. Within moments, another table beneath the chandelier had become empty. Maya continued moving naturally from group to group, never mentioning danger. One elderly veteran accepted an invitation to sample a rare coffee blend near the entrance. 2 business executives agreed to continue their conversation beside the panoramic windows, after she mentioned the quieter seating area. Each small conversation gently reduced the number of guests, sitting beneath the enormous crystal fixture, without creating the slightest hint of panic. Across the ballroom, Ethan Caldwell continued speaking with growing confidence. Giant display screens behind him showcased architectural renderings, while applause interrupted his presentation every few minutes. One international investor leaned toward another and whispered, "He always knows how to command a room." Ethan smiled as another round of cameras flashed. He believed the event was unfolding perfectly. Only Maya noticed that the chandelier was no longer merely producing faint metallic clicks. Now the decorative crystals nearest the center trembled ever so slightly. Most people would have mistaken the movement for reflections dancing in the sunlight. She knew better. Carlos returned from the hallway looking increasingly concerned. "Engineering says they are on the way." Maya quietly asked, "How long?" "5 more minutes." Maya looked toward the chandelier again. 5 minutes suddenly felt like a very long time. She lowered her voice. "Carlos, please ask the servers to begin clearing the center tables first. Tell them the photographer needs more room for the next announcement." Carlos understood immediately. "Without alarming anyone?" Maya nodded. "Exactly." He hurried away. One by one, servers politely approached guests beneath the chandelier. "Ladies and gentlemen, would you mind shifting slightly toward the side tables? Our production team needs additional space for the media presentation." The explanation sounded completely reasonable. Several guests willingly moved while continuing their conversations without interruption. Maya felt a small sense of relief as more chairs became empty. Yet not everyone cooperated. The most important investors remained seated directly beneath the center of the ballroom. Ethan himself had stepped away from the podium, and now stood among them discussing final contract details. The largest signing table had been intentionally positioned beneath the chandelier for dramatic photographs. Maya hesitated only briefly before walking toward Ethan once again. She stopped several feet away, careful not to interrupt his conversation abruptly. "Excuse me, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan turned, his smile fading almost instantly when he recognized her. "Miss Johnson." Maya spoke quietly enough that only the nearby executives could hear. "I am very sorry to interrupt again, but I truly believe everyone should move away from this area until maintenance arrives." Ethan let out a slow breath. One investor glanced upward with mild curiosity before looking back at Ethan. Another smiled impatiently. Ethan folded his arms. "You already expressed your concern." "Yes, sir. And I already answered." Maya remained respectful. "The sounds are becoming more frequent." Ethan shook his head. "There are reporters here from 3 national networks." He gestured toward the cameras. "Hundreds of millions of dollars depend on this announcement." Maya looked directly into his eyes. "Money can wait a few minutes." Ethan's expression hardened. "This conversation is over." Before Maya could respond, a sharp metallic snap echoed somewhere above the ballroom ceiling. It lasted less than a second. Almost everyone continued talking. Almost everyone except Maya. She slowly lifted her eyes toward the chandelier. One of the massive support cables had become visibly loose, and for the first time that afternoon, she no longer wondered whether something might happen. She knew it would. The sharp metallic snap echoed through the ballroom a second time. This time it was louder. Several nearby guests finally looked toward the ceiling, their conversations interrupted by the unfamiliar sound. Maya Johnson did not hesitate. Years of trusting quiet instincts took over before fear had time to settle in. She stepped forward and raised her voice just enough to be heard without creating panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I ask everyone near the center tables to move toward the windows, please? We need to clear this area immediately." Her tone remained calm, steady, and respectful. Some guests looked confused. Others instinctively obeyed simply because of the confidence in her voice. Ethan Caldwell turned sharply toward her. "Miss Johnson." She met his eyes. "Sir, please move everyone now." Ethan glanced briefly upward. The enormous crystal chandelier still sparkled beautifully beneath the afternoon sunlight. To him, nothing appeared different. "You are disrupting the event." Maya spoke more firmly than before, though her voice never became disrespectful. "Please trust me." Before Ethan could respond, another creaking sound drifted through the steel framework above the ballroom ceiling. This time several investors heard it as well. One woman looked uneasily toward the chandelier. "Did anyone else hear that?" Another guest slowly stood from his chair. Maya seized the moment. "Please follow me toward the garden windows." Several employees immediately understood what she was trying to do. Carlos quietly motioned for nearby servers to help guide guests without alarming them. Chairs slid backward across the marble floor. Conversations became whispers. Families picked up handbags and jackets. Elderly guests accepted helping hands from hotel staff. Maya continued moving from table to table with remarkable composure. "This way, please. Watch your step. Everything is all right. We simply need a little more space for a moment." She never used frightening words. She never shouted. She simply kept people moving. Ethan remained standing beside the signing table with several major investors. One executive frowned. "Should we relocate?" Ethan hesitated. Pride and uncertainty battled across his face. Before he could answer, the largest crystal strand beneath the chandelier swayed noticeably from side to side. This time everyone saw it. Silence swept across the ballroom. Maya's voice became stronger. "Everyone away from the center. Please move now." The remaining hesitation disappeared instantly. Guests began walking quickly toward the outer edges of the ballroom, while hotel employees opened additional exits to reduce congestion. Ethan finally stepped away from the signing table, motioning for the investors to follow him. At that exact moment, a loud grinding sound echoed above the ceiling. Time seemed to slow. Hundreds of crystal pieces shimmered beneath the afternoon light as the enormous chandelier suddenly tilted several inches to one side. Gasps filled the ballroom. Maya instinctively reached an elderly woman who had frozen in place. "Come with me." She gently guided the woman toward the nearest open aisle, while Carlos helped another guest using a cane. Several servers calmly directed families away from the center without pushing or shouting. Then, with one final metallic crack, part of the massive decorative structure broke free from its mounting. The enormous chandelier dropped heavily onto the now nearly empty signing area below, sending crystal fragments and decorative metal across the polished marble floor. Tables collapsed beneath the weight. Microphones toppled. Flower arrangements scattered across the stage. The sound echoed throughout the hotel before complete silence followed. No screams. No chaos. Only stunned disbelief. For several long seconds nobody moved. Dust from shattered decorative plaster drifted gently through the sunlight while the ballroom remained frozen. Ethan stared at the ruined signing table only a few feet away. Less than a minute earlier, he and several investors had been standing directly beneath it. Slowly he turned toward Maya. She was kneeling beside the elderly woman she had helped, gently asking, "Are you all right, ma'am?" The woman nodded, still trembling. Hotel security and maintenance teams rushed into the ballroom as emergency personnel were immediately notified. One maintenance supervisor looked up at the damaged ceiling before lowering his head in disbelief. If the room had still been full. He stopped himself, unable to finish the sentence. Ethan heard every word. He looked once more at the empty space beneath the collapsed chandelier, then back at Maya. The warning he had dismissed only minutes earlier had quietly become the reason nearly every guest in that ballroom was now standing safely on the other side of the room. Silence lingered inside the grand sapphire ballroom long after the last crystal settled across the polished marble floor. The magnificent chandelier that had welcomed distinguished guests only moments earlier now lay twisted across the empty signing platform, surrounded by broken glass, bent metal, and scattered flower arrangements. Dust drifted slowly through the golden afternoon sunlight, giving the entire room an unreal stillness. Nobody spoke. Hundreds of guests simply stared at the space where they had been sitting less than a minute before. Ethan Caldwell remained frozen beside one of the side aisles. His breathing had become noticeably slower as the realization settled into his mind. He looked at the collapsed chandelier, then at the empty chairs beneath it. Finally, his eyes found Maya Johnson, who was still kneeling beside the elderly woman she had guided to safety. "Are you feeling all right?" Maya asked gently. The woman nodded, still visibly shaken. "I think so." Maya smiled reassuringly. "Take your time. There is no rush." Nearby, Carlos helped another guest find a chair while hotel staff distributed bottled water to those who appeared overwhelmed. Nobody shouted. Nobody blamed anyone. The atmosphere had shifted from celebration to quiet gratitude. Within minutes, hotel engineers and emergency inspectors entered the ballroom carrying equipment. They carefully examined the damaged ceiling before speaking privately with hotel management. Ethan watched them from a distance until one senior structural engineer approached. "Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan turned. "Yes." The engineer looked toward the collapsed chandelier before answering. "Our preliminary assessment suggests one of the primary suspension connections failed unexpectedly." Ethan remained silent. The engineer continued. "Based on the fracture pattern, the warning signs had probably been developing for some time." Ethan slowly looked toward Maya once more. "She heard it." The engineer nodded. "Very likely." Another inspector joined the conversation holding several photographs taken near the ceiling. The decorative support rod showed visible stress before failure. He paused. Someone paying close attention could absolutely have recognized unusual movement or sound beforehand. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Every word Maya had spoken returned with painful clarity. "I heard unusual movement from the support hardware. Please move the guests. Money can wait a few minutes." He had dismissed every warning, not because the evidence was weak, but because he believed the warning had come from someone whose voice carried less importance than his own. Across the ballroom, several investors quietly approached Maya. One elderly gentleman extended his hand. "Miss." She smiled politely. "Johnson. Miss Johnson." His voice carried genuine respect. "Thank you." Another guest nodded. "You remained calm while. The rest of us had no idea what was happening." Maya shook her head modestly. "Everyone cooperated. That made everything much easier." A woman standing nearby smiled warmly. "No." She glanced toward Ethan before looking back at Maya. "You were the only person who recognized the danger before it became obvious." Maya lowered her eyes. "Sometimes small things deserve our attention." Ethan heard that sentence from across the room. Small things deserve our attention. He suddenly realized that leadership had never been about seeing farther than everyone else. Sometimes it simply meant listening to the person who noticed what others ignored. Carlos quietly walked over carrying Maya's silver serving tray. He handed it back with a grateful smile. "You forgot this." Maya laughed softly. "I almost did." Carlos looked toward the damaged ballroom. "I do not think anyone will remember the lunch." Maya glanced around at the guests now comforting one another near the windows. "I hope they remember getting home safely." Carlos nodded silently. Ethan stood alone for another long moment before taking one slow step toward Maya. Then another. For perhaps the first time in his life, approaching another person felt far more difficult than standing before hundreds of investors. He had built companies worth billions of dollars, negotiated impossible business deals, spoken confidently before international audiences. Yet none of those experiences prepared him for walking across a ballroom to face the woman whose quiet warning had saved him from the consequences of his own pride. Ethan Caldwell stopped only a few feet away from Maya Johnson. Around them, the ballroom remained unusually quiet as engineers continued examining the damaged ceiling and hotel staff calmly escorted guests toward the adjoining reception lounge. The celebration that had filled the room less than an hour earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by quiet conversations and grateful embraces. Maya carefully placed her silver serving tray on a nearby service station before turning toward Ethan. "Is everyone accounted for?" she asked Carlos. He nodded. "Every guest has been checked. A few people are understandably shaken, but everyone is safe." Maya smiled with visible relief. "That is wonderful." Ethan listened without interrupting. Even now, after everything that had happened, her first concern was still everyone else. Finally he spoke. "Miss Johnson." She turned toward him with the same calm expression she had maintained all afternoon. "Yes, sir." Ethan hesitated. The words that usually came so easily refused to appear. He looked briefly at the shattered chandelier before meeting her eyes again. "I owe you an apology." Maya remained silent, allowing him the space to continue. "When you came to me the first time, you were not emotional. You were not disrespectful. You simply shared what you had observed." He lowered his head slightly. "I dismissed you because I assumed my position made my judgment more valuable than yours." The admission hung quietly between them. Maya answered gently. "You had a great deal happening today." Ethan slowly shook his head. "That is not an excuse." His voice had become noticeably softer. "The truth is much simpler." He took a slow breath. "I listened to your uniform before I listened to your words." Several nearby employees quietly looked toward them before respectfully returning to their work. Maya studied Ethan's face for a moment. There was no defensiveness left, only genuine regret. "Thank you for saying that," she replied softly. Ethan continued. "I have spent years believing leadership meant always projecting certainty." He glanced around the damaged ballroom. Today's certainty almost became arrogance. Maya looked toward the broken chandelier. Sometimes confidence becomes stronger after it learns to ask questions. Ethan smiled sadly. "I wish I had asked one." Just then, the senior structural engineer approached carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Caldwell." Ethan turned. "Yes. We completed our initial inspection." He held up several photographs showing the damaged support assembly. Miss Johnson's observations were completely accurate. The warning sounds came from progressive stress inside the suspension hardware. Based on what we found, her decision to encourage guests away from the center area significantly reduced the number of people exposed when the structure failed. Ethan quietly accepted the report. "Thank you." The engineer nodded respectfully toward Maya. "You noticed something many people would have ignored." After he walked away, Ethan looked down at the photographs for several seconds before carefully closing the folder. "You trusted your instincts." Maya smiled faintly. "I trusted what I heard." "Where did you learn that?" She answered simply. "Years ago I attended workplace safety courses while working convention events. One instructor always repeated the same sentence." Ethan waited. "Structures usually whisper before they fail." Ethan looked once more toward the damaged ceiling. "People probably do the same." Maya nodded gently. "Sometimes they do." Those words settled deeply inside him. He suddenly realized the lesson extended far beyond a chandelier. Employees whispered concerns before companies developed problems. Families whispered loneliness before relationships drifted apart. Communities whispered needs before crises emerged. The people willing to notice those whispers often stood quietly in the background, overlooked until it was almost too late. Ethan folded the inspection report and slipped it beneath his arm. "Miss Johnson." She looked at him. "When this ballroom is repaired and everyone goes home." He paused briefly. "Would you allow me the opportunity to properly thank you?" Maya smiled with quiet humility. "Everyone getting home safely is thanks enough for me." Ethan understood why people respected her. She had never been trying to prove she was right. She had simply been trying to protect people. And standing inside the silent ballroom surrounded by broken crystal and scattered light, Ethan Caldwell realized that the wisest voice in the room had belonged to the one person he had almost refused to hear. The ballroom remained closed for the rest of the afternoon while hotel engineers continued their inspection, but life beyond the damaged doors slowly resumed. Guests gathered inside an elegant reception lounge overlooking the Manhattan skyline, accepting fresh coffee and bottled water, while quietly replaying the events they had just witnessed. Instead of discussing investment opportunities, they spoke about the young waitress who had noticed what everyone else had missed. Maya Johnson moved naturally through the room carrying a silver coffee pot, offering warm drinks to guests with the same gentle smile she had worn before the incident. She never mentioned the chandelier. She never reminded anyone that she had been right. To her, the important part of the story had already ended the moment everyone was safe. An elderly woman accepted a cup of tea before reaching for Maya's hand. My granddaughter was sitting beside me. Her voice trembled slightly. If you had not asked us to move. She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Maya gently squeezed her hand. I am just grateful you are both all right. Nearby, the little girl from the young family Maya had quietly guided toward the photo area earlier walked over holding a folded paper napkin covered with colorful crayon drawings. This is for you, she said shyly. Maya knelt to her level and unfolded it carefully. The child had drawn a smiling waitress standing beside a huge sparkling chandelier with bright sunshine filling the room. Above the drawing, written in large uneven letters, were the words, "Thank you for helping everybody." Maya smiled warmly. This is beautiful. The little girl wrapped her arms around Maya before running back to her parents. Across the lounge, Ethan Caldwell watched the exchange from a distance. No cameras were recording now. No reporters were asking questions. Nobody knew he was standing quietly beside the windows observing something that money could never purchase. Respect. Not because Maya had demanded it. Because she had earned it without ever asking. Carlos approached Ethan carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one over without speaking. After a long moment, Ethan asked quietly, "How long has she worked here?" "Almost 5 years." "Has she always been like this?" Carlos smiled. "Every single day." Ethan looked toward Maya again. "Why did nobody tell me?" Carlos answered honestly. "Most people who quietly take care of everyone else rarely become the subject of executive meetings." Ethan nodded slowly. The sentence stayed with him. Throughout his career he had studied quarterly reports, investment projections, construction schedules, and financial forecasts with extraordinary attention. Yet somehow he had overlooked the people who quietly held everything together one thoughtful action at a time. His phone vibrated inside his jacket pocket. The screen displayed dozens of unread messages from reporters requesting statements about the ballroom incident. Public relations advisors wanted immediate interviews. Legal consultants requested conference calls. Investors were asking whether the signing ceremony would be rescheduled. Ethan looked at the notifications for several seconds before pressing the power button and slipping the phone back into his pocket. For the first time in many years, the most important conversation waiting for him had nothing to do with business. Hotel management entered the lounge shortly afterward, accompanied by the chief structural engineer. The room gradually became quiet again. The engineer addressed the guests calmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have completed our initial inspection. We can confirm that the ballroom was evacuated before the decorative fixture experienced structural failure. We are grateful for the calm cooperation shown by everyone present today." He paused before continuing. "We also wish to recognize one member of the hotel staff whose observations and actions played a critical role in preventing a far more serious situation." Every head slowly turned toward Maya. She looked genuinely surprised. The engineer smiled respectfully. "Miss Johnson, your attention to detail and your calm response protected many people today." Soft applause began near the front of the room before spreading naturally throughout the lounge. Maya looked down modestly, clearly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. Ethan joined the applause without hesitation. As he watched the room fill with grateful faces, he understood that true influence was never measured by how many people listened when you spoke. It was measured by how many lives were quietly made better, because you cared enough to notice what others ignored. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling inside the reception lounge remained. Maya Johnson quietly returned to her work as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She refilled coffee cups, collected empty glasses, and asked every guest the same simple question. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" Her calmness amazed everyone around her. Ethan Caldwell watched from across the room, struggling to understand how someone who had just been publicly recognized could immediately return to serving others without expecting more attention. Karen Blake, the hotel's general manager, approached Maya with a warm smile. "Engineering would like to speak with you for a few minutes if you have time." Maya nodded politely. "Of course." A few moments later, she entered a quiet conference room where the chief structural engineer and a city building inspector were reviewing photographs, inspection reports, and maintenance records spread across a large wooden table. The inspector stood as Maya entered. "Miss Johnson, thank you for coming." She smiled politely. "How can I help?" The engineer pointed toward an enlarged photograph of the damaged suspension assembly. "We wanted to understand exactly what you noticed before the failure." Maya studied the image for a moment. The first thing was the sound. She pointed gently toward one of the support brackets. "It was not loud. It was irregular." The engineer nodded. "Anything else?" "One decorative rod vibrated differently from the others." She paused. Then a row of crystal strands began moving even though there was almost no airflow inside the ballroom. The building inspector exchanged an impressed glance with the engineer. "Those were exactly the warning signs our forensic analysis identified." Maya looked surprised. "Really?" The engineer smiled. "Most people focus on what they see. Experienced observers pay attention to what changes." He carefully closed the inspection folder. "Your observations matched our technical findings almost perfectly." Maya lowered her eyes modestly. "I was fortunate enough to notice." The inspector gently shook his head. "No." He smiled respectfully. "You paid attention when everyone else was distracted." Outside the conference room, Ethan happened to overhear part of the conversation through the partially open doorway. He remained quietly in the hallway, not wanting to interrupt. For the first time he realized Maya had not acted on fear or instinct alone. Her warning had been supported by careful observation, practical knowledge, and calm judgment. She had not guessed. She had assessed. A few minutes later the meeting ended. As Maya stepped into the hallway, she found Ethan waiting several feet away. "I hope I did not interrupt," he said quietly. Maya smiled. "Not at all." Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "I just learned that your warning was confirmed by the city's inspection team." Maya nodded gently. "I am glad they found the problem." Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. "You keep saying you are glad." She looked slightly puzzled. "Yes. You never say you were right." Maya smiled softly. Being right would not have mattered if people had been hurt. Ethan remained silent. That answer stayed with him longer than any boardroom presentation he had ever attended. Just then, one of the senior investors entered the hallway carrying a leather briefcase. He walked directly toward Ethan before turning to Maya. "Miss Johnson." She looked up. "Yes, sir." The investor extended his hand. "I have invested in companies for over 30 years. Maya shook his hand politely. "Today I learned that character is the most valuable investment of all." He smiled warmly before leaving for the elevator. Ethan watched him disappear down the hallway before quietly turning back toward Maya. The billionaire who had spent decades measuring success by profits, acquisitions, and market value suddenly understood that the most important lesson of the day had never been about a collapsed chandelier. It had been about the quiet strength of a woman whose wisdom had been overlooked simply because too many people judged the uniform she wore before listening to the truth she spoke. By early evening, the emergency inspection had officially concluded, and the Grand Sapphire Ballroom remained sealed behind temporary barriers, while engineers continued documenting every detail of the structural failure. Most guests had already departed, but a small group of investors remained inside one of the hotel's private conference rooms, discussing how the day's events would affect future business. Ethan Caldwell sat quietly at the end of the polished mahogany table, listening far more than he spoke. That alone surprised everyone present. One senior executive finally broke the silence. "Ethan, the press will focus on the accident." Another investor gently shook his head. "No." He looked around the room before continuing. "The story is not the chandelier." Several people looked toward him. "The story is that a waitress noticed the danger, warned everyone, and was ignored." The room fell silent again. Nobody challenged his words because everyone knew they were true. Ethan slowly folded his hands together. You are right. It was the first time that afternoon anyone had heard him say those words without hesitation. He looked toward the window overlooking Manhattan, as the city lights gradually replaced the fading sunlight. If she had decided to stay quiet after I dismissed her. He stopped speaking, unable to finish the thought. Across the hotel, Maya Johnson had already changed back into her simple navy jacket after completing her shift. Before leaving, she quietly helped several coworkers finish cleaning the reception lounge, even though her scheduled hours had ended long ago. Carlos noticed and smiled. You know you can go home. Maya laughed softly while stacking the last tray. I know. Then why are you still here? She looked around the room. Because everyone had a longer day than they expected. Emily, another waitress, overheard the conversation and smiled. You really never stop helping people, do you? Maya shrugged gently. Someone helped me once. I am only continuing the favor. Neither Carlos nor Emily asked any more questions. Somehow they understood that her kindness had roots much deeper than today's events. As Maya collected her backpack from the employee locker room, Karen Blake approached carrying a small envelope. This arrived while you were working. Maya accepted it curiously. Inside was a handwritten note from the elderly couple she had first guided away from the center tables. The message was brief. Because you asked us to move, we will celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary together next month. Thank you for giving us that gift. Maya quietly folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. She smiled, not because she wanted recognition, but because she imagined two people sharing another year together. Downstairs, Ethan remained alone inside the conference room after the investors departed. The silence felt unfamiliar. His assistant entered carrying a tablet. Your evening schedule has been updated. Ethan looked up. Cancel everything. The assistant blinked in surprise. Everything. Everything. He stood and walked toward the window. There is one conversation I should have had hours ago. A few minutes later, he asked the hotel manager where Maya had gone. She should be in the employee hallway, Karen answered. Ethan thanked her and quietly made his way through the nearly empty corridors. Along the way, he passed maintenance workers repairing damaged ceiling panels, hotel staff returning furniture to storage, and housekeepers polishing floors that had already been cleaned once before. Every person he encountered nodded politely. For the first time, Ethan slowed down long enough to greet each of them by name whenever he recognized a name tag. The simple act felt strangely important. When he finally reached the employee exit, he saw Maya standing outside beneath the soft glow of the evening lights, waiting for the crosswalk signal with her backpack resting comfortably over one shoulder. She believed the day was finally over. She had no idea that the billionaire who had ignored her warning only hours earlier was about to walk out those doors carrying something far more valuable than an apology. He was carrying the willingness to become a different man. I waited too long to hear you. Ethan Caldwell spoke quietly as he stepped onto the sidewalk outside the hotel. The evening air carried the familiar sounds of Manhattan traffic, while office workers hurried toward subway entrances beneath the glow of streetlights. Maya Johnson turned as the crosswalk signal changed from red to white. She had one hand resting on the strap of her backpack and the other tucked inside the pocket of her navy jacket. She looked slightly surprised to see Ethan walking toward her without assistants, security personnel, or reporters surrounding him. Good evening, Mr. Caldwell, she said politely. Ethan stopped a comfortable distance away. Good evening, Miss Johnson. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence felt honest rather than uncomfortable. Finally, Ethan looked directly at her. May I walk with you for a minute? Maya smiled gently. Of course. They crossed the street together, blending into the steady flow of pedestrians. Ethan glanced toward the city skyline before speaking again. I have replayed our conversations all afternoon. Maya remained quiet, allowing him to continue. You warned me 3 different times. He smiled sadly. Each time I heard your voice, but I never truly listened. Maya looked ahead at the traffic moving through the intersection. Sometimes people are focused on something else. Ethan shook his head. No. His answer came gently but firmly. I was focused on myself. He paused before continuing. I believed experience, wealth, and authority made me the smartest person in every room. Maya did not rush to respond. After a few moments she quietly asked, "And now?" Ethan laughed softly. "Now I know the smartest person may be carrying a serving tray." Maya smiled. "Or wearing a construction helmet. Or pushing a cleaning cart." Ethan nodded. "Or sitting quietly in the back without anyone noticing." They continued walking beneath rows of glowing streetlights. After another block, Ethan stopped beside a small public park where autumn leaves rested beneath wooden benches. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a business card. "This is not a job offer," he said before handing it to Maya. She accepted it curiously. On the back, Ethan had written his personal phone number in blue ink. "Why are you giving me this?" Ethan answered honestly, "Because I need someone who is willing to tell me when I am wrong." Maya looked at the card, then back at him. "That is a rare request." Ethan smiled. "It is a lesson I should have learned years ago." Maya carefully slipped the card into her backpack. "I appreciate your trust." Ethan took a slow breath. "Tomorrow morning I am meeting with every executive in my company." Maya listened quietly. "We are changing one policy immediately." "What kind of policy?" "Any employee who raises a legitimate safety concern will be heard before any business decision continues." Maya smiled warmly. "That sounds like a good beginning." Ethan nodded. "It is only a beginning." He looked toward the evening traffic. "The harder part is changing the people who enforce the policy." Maya answered with the same calm wisdom she had shown all day. "Policies teach procedures. Leaders teach culture." Ethan repeated the sentence softly to himself. "Leaders teach culture." He knew he would remember those words for a very long time. Just then Maya's phone vibrated. She smiled after reading the message. "Everything all right?" Ethan asked. "My younger brother." Her eyes brightened. "He passed his engineering certification exam today." Ethan smiled genuinely. "Please congratulate him for me." "I will." They stood quietly for another moment before Maya looked toward the subway entrance. "I should head home." Ethan nodded. "Thank you for giving me a few minutes." Maya smiled kindly. "Thank you for using them well." As she disappeared into the evening crowd, Ethan remained standing beneath the streetlights with his hands in his pockets. He realized that the greatest investment he would ever make would not appear on a financial statement. It would be measured by how many voices he chose to hear before the next person quietly whispered a warning that everyone else was too busy to notice. The next morning, the headquarters of Caldwell Global Development looked exactly as it always had. Sunlight reflected from the glass walls of the executive boardroom overlooking Manhattan, polished conference tables stretched across the room, and senior executives quietly reviewed financial reports while waiting for Ethan Caldwell to begin the weekly leadership meeting. Usually, these meetings started with quarterly projections, construction schedules, or investment opportunities. This morning was different. Ethan entered carrying only a thin folder instead of the thick stack of financial documents everyone expected. He greeted each executive before taking his seat at the head of the table. After a brief silence, he closed the folder without opening it. "Before we discuss business," he began calmly, "we are going to discuss yesterday." Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan continued. "Most of you have already read the preliminary engineering report." Heads nodded around the table. "What you may not know is that one employee warned me before the structural failure happened." A vice president spoke carefully. "The waitress." Ethan nodded. "Yes." Another executive asked, "Did engineering confirm her observations?" Ethan slid a copy of the inspection report across the table. "Every detail." The room became noticeably quieter as several leaders reviewed the photographs and technical findings. Ethan folded his hands. "Yesterday I ignored accurate information because I judged the messenger instead of the message." No one interrupted him. "That mistake almost became the greatest failure of my career." He stood and slowly walked toward the large windows overlooking the city. Many companies claim employees are their greatest asset. He turned back toward the room. "Yesterday I realized those words mean nothing if leaders refuse to listen." The executives remained completely silent. Ethan continued. "Effective immediately, every property owned by Caldwell Global Development will adopt a new safety reporting policy." He paused before speaking each word clearly. "Any employee, regardless of position, has the authority to pause an event, meeting, or operation when they identify a credible safety concern until that concern is properly evaluated. One executive looked surprised. Even entry-level staff? Especially entry-level staff. Ethan answered without hesitation. Risk does not care about job titles. Another executive slowly smiled. Neither does the truth. Ethan nodded appreciatively. Exactly. He then removed another document from the folder. There is something else. He placed the paper in the center of the table. At the top appeared the title Leadership Listening Initiative. Beginning next month, every executive, including me, will spend one full workday each quarter alongside frontline employees. Curious expressions spread around the room. Ethan continued. Servers, housekeepers, maintenance technicians, security officers, receptionists. He looked at each executive individually. If we expect people to trust our decisions, we must first understand their work. Nobody argued. In fact, several executives quietly nodded. They had all witnessed yesterday's events. They knew why this conversation mattered. After the meeting concluded, Ethan asked everyone to remain seated for one final announcement. I invited someone to join us this morning. A gentle knock came from the conference room door. Maya Johnson stepped inside wearing the same simple white shirt and black slacks she wore at work, clearly uncomfortable standing before a room full of executives. Ethan smiled warmly. Thank you for coming. Maya nodded politely. Thank you for inviting me. Ethan turned toward his leadership team. Yesterday this woman reminded me that wisdom often speaks with a quiet voice. He paused. Today I would like every leader in this company to hear that voice. Maya looked around the room before speaking softly. I am not an expert in business. Ethan smiled. No. He glanced toward the executives. You are an expert at paying attention. Maya thought for a moment before answering. The people closest to the work usually notice problems first. The room remained silent as every executive listened. If you make them feel safe enough to speak, she continued gently, they may also help you prevent problems before they become disasters. Ethan realized that no motivational speech he had ever delivered carried the quiet power of those simple words, and as every leader in the room thoughtfully reflected on them, the culture of an entire company began changing because one waitress had refused to ignore a whisper that everyone else failed to hear. Over the following weeks, the changes Ethan Caldwell announced did not remain words printed inside a company handbook. They became visible in small moments that slowly transformed the culture of Caldwell Global Development. At construction sites, supervisors paused when workers raised concerns instead of dismissing them. Inside corporate offices, receptionists were invited to safety meetings for the first time. Hotel managers began asking housekeepers, maintenance teams, servers, and security officers a simple question at the beginning of every shift. Has anyone noticed anything we should know today? At first, employees answered cautiously. They had spent years believing their observations mattered less than the opinions of executives. But as days passed and leaders genuinely listened, confidence quietly began replacing hesitation. Maya Johnson never expected to become part of those changes. She continued working at the Sterling Crown Hotel with the same calm professionalism as before. She still greeted guests with a warm smile, still remembered regular customers by name, and still quietly noticed the little details others overlooked. One afternoon, while preparing a private banquet room for another large event, a new server named Lily hesitated before approaching Maya. Can I ask you something? Maya smiled. Of course. Lily looked slightly embarrassed. I notice one of the portable display platforms feels unstable, but I was afraid everyone would think I was overreacting. Maya looked toward the platform before gently placing one hand on its edge. It shifted almost imperceptibly. She smiled reassuringly. You did the right thing by speaking up. Together they informed the banquet manager, who immediately requested maintenance. A few minutes later, technicians discovered that one locking mechanism had not been fully secured after being moved earlier that morning. The repair took less than 10 minutes. As the maintenance supervisor finished tightening the hardware, he smiled at Lily. Good catch. Lily looked toward Maya. I almost stayed quiet. Maya answered softly. The smallest voice can prevent the biggest problem. Across town, Ethan received the routine safety report from the hotel later that afternoon. One short paragraph described the unstable display platform, the employee who reported it, and the immediate repair that followed. Ethan read the report twice before smiling quietly. He reached for a pen and wrote one sentence across the bottom of the page before sending it back to the hotel manager. Please thank the employee for choosing to speak. The following morning, that handwritten note was placed on the staff bulletin board where every employee could see it. Nobody applauded. Nobody made a speech. Yet something important happened. Employees began believing that paying attention was not only allowed, it was valued. Several days later, Ethan visited the hotel again without cameras or reporters. He found Maya arranging silverware before lunch service began. "Good morning," he said. She looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan handed her a small framed photograph. It showed the grand sapphire ballroom after its complete restoration. Bright sunlight filled the room, new safety systems had been installed, and above the entrance hung a simple bronze plaque. Maya looked closely at the inscription beneath the photograph. "This ballroom stands because people cared enough to listen." She looked up with quiet surprise. Ethan smiled. "Those words belong to you." Maya gently shook her head. "No." She looked at the photograph once more. "They belong to everyone willing to hear them." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood exactly what she meant. Buildings could always be repaired. Policies could always be rewritten. Even damaged reputations could eventually recover. But the greatest change happened when ordinary people believed their voices mattered, and leaders became humble enough to prove that they were listening. Standing together inside the peaceful ballroom where fear had once filled the air, neither of them spoke for several moments. They simply watched employees preparing another ordinary day, knowing that because one quiet warning had finally been heard, countless future warnings would never be ignored again. 6 months later, the Grand Sapphire Ballroom once again welcomed distinguished guests from around the country, but this gathering felt remarkably different from the one that had taken place the previous spring. Sunlight poured through. The same towering windows, crystal chandeliers sparkled above elegantly arranged tables, and quiet music drifted through the beautifully restored room. Yet one small detail immediately caught the attention of every visitor entering the ballroom. Beside the entrance stood a simple bronze plaque engraved with a single sentence. "The strongest organizations are built by leaders who choose to listen." Guests often paused to read the words before stepping inside. Some smiled thoughtfully. Others asked hotel employees about the story behind the plaque. Every employee told the same story. Not about a billionaire, not about a damaged chandelier, but about a waitress who noticed something small because she cared enough to pay attention. Maya Johnson continued working at the Sterling Crown Hotel exactly as she always had. She still greeted guests with warmth, still carried silver serving trays through elegant dining rooms, and still quietly noticed details that others overlooked. Her life had not become glamorous. She had not asked for promotions, publicity, or awards. The greatest reward remained exactly what it had always been: watching people leave safely at the end of the day. On that particular afternoon, Maya welcomed another large business conference into the ballroom. Among the arriving guests was a young manager attending his very first executive leadership seminar. After reading the plaque near the entrance, he turned to Ethan Caldwell, who had been invited to deliver the keynote address. "Sir," the young manager asked, "who wrote those words?" Ethan smiled before looking across the ballroom toward Maya, who was helping an elderly couple find their seats with the same quiet kindness she showed everyone. "The woman who inspired them probably would not claim they were hers," he answered. "She would simply tell you to pay attention to the people standing closest to the problem." The young manager nodded thoughtfully. During his speech later that afternoon, Ethan stood before hundreds of executives without discussing profits, acquisitions, or market forecasts. Instead, he told them about leadership. "The greatest mistake of my career," he said calmly, "was believing authority automatically made my judgment more valuable than someone else's observation." The ballroom became completely silent. "I learned that wisdom does not arrive wearing expensive suits. Sometimes it arrives wearing a name tag and carrying a serving tray." Many people quietly wrote those words into their notebooks. Others simply listened. When the conference ended, Ethan walked toward the dining room where Maya was clearing the final table of the afternoon. He smiled warmly. Another successful event. Maya looked around at the guests, leaving with relaxed smiles. Everyone made it home safely. Ethan nodded. That is becoming my favorite measure of success. Maya laughed softly. It is a good one. Outside the hotel, the evening sun settled gently behind the Manhattan skyline, casting long bands of golden light across the glass entrance and the busy sidewalks beyond. Employees finished their shifts, guests returned to their families, and another ordinary day quietly came to an end. Ethan paused for one last look through the ballroom windows before leaving. He no longer noticed the restored chandelier first. He noticed the people beneath it, the servers greeting guests, the maintenance technician checking equipment one final time, the security officer welcoming arrivals with a smile. The quiet voices that once blended into the background had become the voices he valued most. Maya locked her employee locker, picked up her familiar backpack, and stepped into the evening with the same gentle confidence she had carried long before anyone knew her story. She had never set out to change a billionaire. She had never tried to prove anyone wrong. She had simply refused to ignore a quiet warning because she believed every life in that ballroom mattered equally. In the end, the chandelier was repaired, the business continued, and the headlines eventually faded. But one lesson remained. Power may command attention, yet character earns trust, and the people who listen before they judge often become the reason everyone else is able to go home.